Hello, sir and everyone. My name is Maria Guadalupe Flamive Carvalho Vong. In this video, I would like to present my paper with the topic of History of Accounting Standard in New Zealand. Apologize for not turning my camera on due to my connection problem. Okay, next, Nelson. For the first introduction, as in accounting history, accounting and history may show up as two unmistakable circles of academic research, but they can intersect. To understand the increasingly regulatory nature of accounting standard and the changing role of accounting profession as a drafter of those standards, it is vital to assess the origins and major characteristics of accounting profession, present the New Zealand Institute, its foundation, and some factors particular to the Institute that have influenced the history of standard setting. The impact of the 2002 choice of the ASRB to adopt a IFRS and the consequences of the choice for standard setting in New Zealand and the New Zealand Institute. Consider how the IFRS decision was made, particularly the international influence on that decision and the implications of that decision for the retention of sector neutral standard and differential reporting. Next. For the first part, we will talk about the accounting history and accounting. In both the United Kingdom and the United States, some accountants were interested not only in the practice of accounting, but also in its development. The accounting history incorporates a solid connection with accounting. Accounting historians are more likely to be accountants than historians are, and accounting history is more likely to be taught and studied in tertiary commerce and business schools than in the humanities. This emphasis on accounting may explain the focus of accounting history studies on the accounting profession, its organizations, and accounting practices. Although accounting history appeared as a specific area of research in the 1970s, the first studies in this discipline came several decades earlier, around the beginning of the 20th century. Next. For the second part, we will talk about the accounting profession in New Zealand. The beginning of the New Zealand Institute and its structure outline why the Institute got to be the only New Zealand accounting association to provide accounting standard. As in other nations, the accounting profession in New Zealand has a history of a variety of associations. Example, in Canada, by 1908, there were institutes of chartered accountants in 7 areas, and in Australia, 18 accounting organizations. At this time, New Zealand had 4 organizations: the Incorporate Institute of Accountants of New Zealand, the Accountants and Auditors Association, the Auckland or Wellington Public Accountants Association, and the Certified Accountants Association of New Zealand. Although New Zealand is a small country, both in size and population, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, there were a large number of New Zealanders doing accounting work, relative to the number of those that practiced in accounting in other countries of British origin. By the end of the 19th century, the 4 organizations were diminished to 2 primary accounting associations, the Accountants and Auditor Association and the Incorporate Institute of Accountants of New Zealand. The older of the 2 associations, the Incorporate Institute, was created in 1893 and enrolled in 1894. Within 2 years, this body was accepting only those who had passed its examination. The Accountants and Auditors Association was formed in 1898, following Auckland's concerns about Wellington's parochialism and the running of the Incorporate Institute's examination. By the end of its first years, the association was itself setting examination for eminent members. Next. For the third part, we will talk about the harmonizing New Zealand and international accounting standard. Given the closeness of economic relations between the New Zealand and Australia, it was logical that one of the goals of the New Zealand government was to harmonize New Zealand accounting standard and Australian standards. Early in 2002, the FRSP consulted several interested groups and in June released ED 92 preface to financial reporting standard. The ARSP supported the FRSP in July 2002. The chairs of the two boards stated that the FRSP feature will develop the financial reporting standard based on a rebuttable presumption that the standard of the International Accounting Standard Board, IASB, and the Public Sector Committee of the International Federation of Accountants, PSC, reflect best international practice, and the board will depart from those standards only in the rare and exceptional circumstances. The two seats hence gave notice of their proposed full move to IFRS as the base for New Zealand accounting standard. The reaction of institute individual and interested groups to the exposure draft demonstrate a common acknowledgement of the choice to present a new set of accounting standard to New Zealand financial reporting. The Australian Association was a critical factor within the ASRB and FRSP choice to adopt IFRS. The FRSP is chosen generally casually. International joining was an objective in the New Zealand standard setting, but the ASRB also had in mind the convergence of New Zealand and Australian accounting standard. The level of communication appeared solid and to work both ways, but in reality, communication was more one-sided, reflecting a more extensive and common asymmetry within the relationship between the two countries. New Zealand accounting boards contact their Australian counterparts more frequently than the Australian standard setting boards approaches the FRSB and ASRB. Next. For the next part is that despite these years of communication and observation, as noted earlier, accounting standards in the two countries were not identical, although they were more similar than different. Adopting IFRS meant that New Zealand standard would now harmonize with Australian standard. The Australian choice to adopt IFRS gave a solid motivation for the FRSB and ASRB to choose that New Zealand does likewise, but from an afterward date. New Zealand has chosen to present IFRS in the diverse years from the Australians. New Zealand backed the ASRB and FRSB choices. In concert with the Australian government, the New Zealand government set up a body to screen the integration of standard setting in the two countries. In 2004, the New Zealand Minister of Finance, Michael Cullen, and the Australian Treasurer, Peter Costello, discharged a joint articulation announcing the creation of a Trans-Tasman Accounting Standard Advisory Group, or WTASAD. One of the group's first assignment was to energize the Standard Development Board in New Zealand and Australia to sign a memorandum of understanding. The memorandum made the chairs of the ASRB and FRC full members, not just observers of each other's board. Other New Zealand Australian organizations working to improve networking and convergence in trans-Tasman relations were also interested in financial reporting. Whereas the standard setters in both New Zealand and Australia concentrated on adopting IFRS, they kept on working towards possible integration of accounting standard setting. And in 2006, the FRSB and the Australian Accounting Standard Board signed a protocol for cooperation between AASB and FRSB. The Australian connection was critical, but it was not the only reason why New Zealand moved to comply with IFRS. Other factors helped the New Zealand board choose in 2002 that it was time for New Zealand to move away from locally produced accounting standard. An increasing number of countries began using IFRS from this time because the International Accounting Standard Committee was replaced in 2001 by the IASB. The IASC had issued a full set of international accounting standards between 1973 and 2001, and in 2000 had received IOSC, identical core set of standards. In any case, the IASC's agreement approach to standards reduced IAS that required noteworthy change before countries such as New Zealand utilized them. Member countries had diverse approaches to standard setting and accounting practices. Next. In the fourth part is about challenges to adopt the International Financial Reporting Standard. The points of interest in adopting IFRS were numerous, but there were a few issues. The first one is sector neutrality. The FRSP found that there were two angles to the issue of keeping up sector neutrality in New Zealand accounting standard. The first issue was to fulfilling the public sector that New Zealand IFRS was available to the sector as New Zealand financial reporting standard had been. The public sector was attentive to how concisely this would be. From 2003, the Office of the Auditor General progressively expressed concerns approximately the process and results of endeavoring to make the IFRS sector neutral. The second issue was the creating complexity of New Zealand entities that produce external financial reports. For the second part is the differential reporting. As New Zealand's financial reporting regime developed, smaller entities had to expand concerns approximately complying with financial reporting requirements. The cost of preparing external financial reports was moderately greater for smaller entities. These entities did not see the need to produce such reports. The point of giving information through common reasons for financial reports useful for investor decision-making did not apply to small entities. So the owners of these entities were nearly continuously and intimately included within their business and had access to information necessary for them to form useful decisions. In New Zealand, the accounting profession recognized that smaller entities need to produce less complex financial statements. In 1994, the Institute introduced a differential reporting framework. When the FRSP was checking IFRS in 2003 and 2004, the board acted to have New Zealand IFRS incorporate a differential reporting regime, obliging the reporting prerequisites of small and medium-sized entities that utilize these standards. Next, Nelson. For the last part is the conclusion. To conclude that the relationship of accounting history to the disciplines of accounting and history and summarize the related to accounting as a profession and standard setting in accounting. Accounting was one of several occupations that became professions during the 19th century. The suggestion of the 2002 New Zealand choice to adopt IFRS from 2005, in specific the factors impacting that choices, how the New Zealand accounting profession went about developing New Zealand IFRS in an endeavor to keep New Zealand standard sector neutral, and the result of the choice. New Zealand choice to adopt IFRS appeared to solve the reasons for numerous reactions and issues around standard credibility and entity compliance. In any case, the choice raised a few new issues, the foremost conspicuous being the failure of New Zealand to hold sector neutral standard. Next. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much.